Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us for what is our second quarterly economic update in a series that the Saskatchewan Construction Association is hosting. Today's theme is investment attraction. The session today is presented by SupplierLink Saskatchewan, which is our industry's first and only automated vendor engagement tool. It's designed to connect the buyers of services with the suppliers of those services. And if you're interested in learning more about SupplierLink, you can visit supplierlinkska.ca. By now, I think everyone is familiar with Zoom, but again, a reminder that this is a Zoom webinar. So the folks that you're seeing on the screen are the panelists and participants in today's discussion. We cannot hear you or see you as webinar attendees, but you should be able to see and hear us. You should see, I think, 9 boxes on your screen with 9 of us on there. If you can't, you might, if you're on your phone, you might need to swipe. If you're on your PC or another computer, you might need to hit the view button in the top right-hand corner. You can ask questions, and you can do that through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. I encourage you to put your questions in there at any time. We will be having a presentation and then a panel discussion, and we'll be looking to get to questions as we can through the discussion. If you leave the webinar at any time, either on purpose or by accident, you can rejoin at any time using the link that was sent to you. And the session is being recorded and will be shared with members after the fact. So today we're starting with an economic update from Val Sleuth with Praxis Consulting in Trendline, Saskatchewan. Val is joined by her colleague, Stephen Johnson. And we will give some time for questions after the presentation. So I'm just going to do a quick intro for Stephen and then Val. Stephen holds his master's and has over 30 years of experience with development and use of economic impact models for the federal and provincial governments and for private sector clients. He successfully completed over 100 economic impact and demographic projection projects, including environmental impact assessments for 15 oil sand developments, 6 potash mines, 2 nuclear reactors, and 3 Arctic mines, which tells me that if anybody understands the economics of investment, it's Stephen. So I think we're lucky to have him here with us. He's also developed numerous models for most provincial events over the past several years. His work experience includes the provincial and national statistics agencies, economic development, housing, health, and gaming. And we have Val from Praxis with over 25 years of experience as a practicing business advisor. Val focuses on business strategy, community engagement, and corporate governance in private and public sector organizations at the provincial, federal, and international levels. She has gained a reputation as a facilitative leader, skilled in navigating complicated strategic issues towards collaborative resolution, and she's committed to her community and is the chair of the upcoming 2022 Saskatchewan Games being held in Regina. I didn't know that. That's awesome, Val. Okay, Val, over to you and Stephen.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for the introduction and the opportunity to present today. We appreciate being able to share some of the Trendline data that we put together on a monthly basis. And just a reminder that this is available by subscription on our website to Trendline. So I'll share that again at the end. So I'll take you through the information. There's a lot here. I'll take you through it all, and then we'll open it up for questions. And we'll engage Stephen as well in the questions because he's very intimate with this data. So just a few key messages before we get going. So first of all, with the vaccine rollout outpacing variant transmission, we expect the economy will be near normal by Q3 and Q4 of 2021. So all major indicators, with the exception of restaurant receipts and resource production, are trending positively. So that's great news. Population continues to grow, although at a softer international migration rate in 2021. And I'll share some more data on that in a few moments. Residential housing starts are positive and will continue to grow in tandem with population growth. As the government kickstarts the economy with spending programs, we expect public sector infrastructure construction will grow, driven primarily by the agriculture and the energy sector bounce back. Sask exports are on path to meet the Saskatchewan Growth Plan goal of a 50% increase, so that's exciting news. And job growth is also positive or on track to achieving that Sask Growth Plan goal of 100,000 new jobs if we use the 2020 year as the base year. Moving forward, here's the information that I'll provide you. So I'll give you some labor market information. We'll talk about population growth, then housing starts and building permits. We'll get into retail sales, manufacturing sales, and restaurant receipts, followed by international trade information, and then close with resource production. So our first slide speaks to labor market. So the red line, of course, indicates connection to the right axis here, which is the unemployment rate. And as we all know, the unemployment rate is just defined by those that are actively looking for work divided by those that are actively looking for work and employed. The blue bars indicate change overall in terms of job changes from year to year. So we saw a significant increase in the unemployment rate in early 2020 relative to the unemployment rate in early 2021, so the first quarter of 2021. And we in fact have seen that as of May, we have an unemployment rate of approximately 6.5%. So employment increases in the last 2 months have seen an increase by about 14,000 people being employed over the same period of 2020. So this is trending positively. The labor market itself, average employment in the labor market from the first quarter of 2020 to the first quarter of 2021, we see the largest job losses were in agriculture, insurance, real estate, information, culture, and recreation. I know those are strange to put together, but that's how StatsCan does it. This also includes casinos, accommodation, and food, also significant reduction. So generally anything that has face-to-face interaction, again, we've seen a reduction. Where we've seen growth is in manufacturing and wholesale and retail trade. Residential construction is also strong. Okay. Moving on, looking at labor market 2021 versus 2020. We use StatsCan economic regions. So unfortunately, this economic region, PA, North Battleford, Lloydminster, and the North is quite large, but this is the way Stats Canada records the data. So we can see primarily that, that growth is really confined to Regina and Saskatoon regions year over year. Population growth, you can see that we've given you a long breadth in terms of the way that we're reporting the data. So this shows growth since 1972. The yellow line is an indication of international migration, and it is driving growth, although it is slower due to border closures into 2020 and 2021. So we're seeing this drop off somewhat, but it has been the primary driver of growth. The blue line represents net interprovincial migration. It also is down considerably. Where we see spikes in net interprovincial migration is usually due to resource booms. And the gray line is talking about natural increase, so birth less deaths, and we can see that that is relatively flat. So international is where we're gaining our population growth. Housing starts, it's a bit of a busy slide, but again, we like to show you as much of a trend as we can, starting with 1990, taking you all the way up to this is taking us into May of 2021. So housing starts are starting to go up due to unprecedented personal savings, record low mortgage rates, and people looking to change their situations so that they have better work at home solutions. Annually, housing starts were 6,700 in 07-08. So we saw a spike in here. That's at 6,700, which was due to the economic boom, and 10,000 in 2012 to 14, again, due to resource pricing and replacement of existing housing stock. We were at 2,800 housing starts in the beginning of 2020. And that is set to top 4,000 in 2021 if the current pace is maintained. Building permits, what we're seeing here is that so far in 2021, building permits are being led by residential, in line with increasing housing starts, and to a lesser extent, public sector and infrastructure growth. So residential seems to be where most of the construction is coming from. Both industrial and commercial are down. Capital investment. So we're seeing a modest recovery over 2020 in capital investment. So you can see it's trending upward, which is great. But I don't think we have much more else to tell you on this slide other than to say that it is improving. Retail sales, also interesting. So on an actual basis, which is the blue line, you can see that retail sales are flat over the most recent period. On a real term basis, which means it's adjusted for inflation, we are seeing a decline. So far in 2021, nominal retail sales are 11% over the first quarter of 2020. So it is improving. Manufacturing shipments. So here we see that manufacturing sales have declined by 2.2 billion. And in 2019, 2020, so we're seeing about a 14% reduction in sales, but have advanced by 20% so far in 2021. So the recovery is largely being led by food and chemicals. So overall, if this is our summation line here, overall, we're seeing some growth. Restaurant receipts. So no surprise, restaurant receipts have declined by 18%. That was in 2020. So far in 2021, we're almost level with 2020, but it's still even down another 0.4%. So we haven't seen that really recover since the beginning of 2020. Limited service eating places are the only ones that are generally seeing some degree of recovery. And again, not a surprise to anybody. Motor vehicle sales. So of course, we've got here passenger cars and trucks, passenger cars being orange, trucks being blue. So motor vehicle sales were down by 14% due to the pandemic. So going into 2020, we saw a 14% reduction simply because people did not want to go into dealerships or test drive vehicles that other people had been in. The savings that people were realizing as a result of not buying vehicles was going into the housing market. So that's where we saw the housing market growth. Now let's look at vehicle sales in 2021. So what we see here is some degree of a bounce back in new vehicle sales, up 18%, which is led by trucks, SUVs, and minivan sales. So this is the growth here, and this is the summary line here. International trade. So the export situation in 2020 is much rosier than other economic indicators. So the number is trending up in 2020, driven by ag and food exports. So our international trade balance was positive because exports are of course increasing faster than imports, which are declining. So we are seeing some trending up in terms of international trade. Again, on international trade in the first 5 months of 2021, exports are up 15%. Recovery is being led by ag value, so farm fishing, intermediate food products, as well as energy products. So this is what's driving the upward trend. In terms of resource production, so let's look at each of these lines individually. So the gray line is potash, and we're seeing that moving up slightly. So we do have some positive trending in potash. The blue is crude oil, which no surprise, we're seeing it's declining. Natural gas, which tends to follow the energy sector, is flattening. And uranium, we're seeing significant drop in uranium, and that is primarily due to reduced production in the north which is driven by commodity cycles. So in 2021, these trends will continue. We don't see a significant change. And of course, potash being a bit of a savior in the resource cycle, the resource sector. Going to the future outlook, this is March data that we gathered from the conference board. By the end of 2021, we'll have almost recovered to 2019 numbers. Interestingly enough, unemployment will recover in 2022. So we will see rates that are consistent with what we saw in 2019. Due to rates, we're thinking these rates might change as it doesn't particularly take into account population increases or the number of people that are looking for work who may not be reporting. The other piece I think that is interesting is here, the unemployment rate. We're likely to see that the unemployment rate will recover in 2022. So you start to see that the unemployment rate starts to look better in 2022. I'll also say here that rates will increase as we see changes in population. Housing starts are also trending positively, so they will continue to increase, and that will be driven by population increase as well as aging housing stock. That is our synopsis of the first quarter of 2021 relative to the first quarter of 2020. Again, encourage you to go to our website. The address is above. The product that we produce is called Trendline, and that is what gives you this data, and it is done on a monthly basis. So thanks, Mark. I think we'll open it up for questions if there are any.
Thanks, Val. I was just going to say that if you're interested in economic data in Saskatchewan, you need to have a subscription to Trendline. I know I do, and I use it all the time, and would encourage anybody who's interested in this kind of information to get one too. So they really are the place to go for this information in the province. Do we have any? So if we do have any questions from any of the attendees, you can put those in the Q&A. Are any questions from any of the panelists?
Yeah, I would ask Mark. Well, Stephen, a lot of those numbers are to the end of 2020. I think it's fair to say as we complete Q2 of 2021, especially on the commodity side, we've seen significant increases. I think if you bought Cameco stock, for example, at the end of last year and you sold it today, you'd be up 80%. So, I mean, there's been a lot of movement in the first half of this year.
Sorry, Paul, is that a question?
Yeah, I'm just thinking that the trend lines really kind of understate the state of the economy right now. That 2020, the end of it was pretty milquetoast mundane, but we've had a fairly strong first 6 months of this year, and that those numbers are trending upward now pretty sharply.
Yeah, Stephen, would you like to comment?
Sure. So all of the indicators that we're tracking for 2021 so far are up, with the exception of restaurant receipts, which is down 0.4 of a percentage point. So it's practically level with last year. And we're also comparing pandemic year against a pandemic year. So everything is looking much more positive than it was last year at this time.
Thanks, Stephen. John, did you have a question?
Yeah, just wonder if you could comment. Some of our data obviously shows that Regina, Saskatoon, and Saskatchewan, actually, we have some of the lowest employment rates compared to other major cities in Canada, particularly Toronto, Edmonton, Calgary, those kinds of things. And I'm just wondering if you can provide some insights into, I think I know part of the answer, but have you looked at that at all and have any perspective in terms of why that is?
John, employment rates or unemployment rates?
Sorry, unemployment.
Yeah. So we're trending poorer than other major cities. Is that what you're saying?
No, we're actually trending better.
Oh, we're trending better. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. Like our data shows, for example, we're we're doing much better compared to Calgary, Toronto, Edmonton, those kinds of cities. Pretty comparable to Winnipeg, and Regina, Saskatchewan are pretty equal. So just wondering if you have any sense of, I think a big part of it obviously has been COVID, particularly in Toronto and places like that. But if you have any perspectives on that.
Again, Stephen, would you like to comment?
Sure. So in Saskatchewan's case, when things are slow, we tend to export our unemployed. So that is why we're seeing a lower unemployment rate in Saskatchewan relative to other provinces. And that's also that degree of out-migration is also being reflected in the slower than usual population growth.
Interesting. So basically, Stephen, you're saying that part of the challenge, that the numbers are hidden a little bit in Saskatchewan because people are leaving to work where there's demand.
That's right. Or there's also a discouraged worker effect where individuals will withdraw from actively seeking employment until they find something that is consistent with their skill set and aspirations, or they go back to school.
One other comment I would make is, as we see that out migration, we become less likely to reach that $1.3 million target in population, which is in the Sask growth plan. So that is one target that I think is concerning for government.
Part of the concern that I've been starting to hear from the construction industry, which I haven't heard in 5 years, is skilled labor shortage, right? And starting to hear about it partly because people aren't willing to come back to work right now, but also because, as Paul noted, as the economy starts to heat up, to Stephen's point, a lot of those folks have gone to BC or Ontario or elsewhere, and we have not been, as an industry or as a province, particularly proactive in planning for when this was going to happen again. And so there's a lot of worry that we're going to be in trouble when it comes to finding skilled labor within the next 18 to 24 months. So that'll be something worth monitoring for sure. Okay, well, let's begin by now to move into our panel, and I want to thank Val and Stephen for the presentation and for the information. Again, I'd encourage everybody to consider subscribing to Trendline Saskatchewan. Always good to hear the perspective from Praxis about where the economy is headed, and it gives us some great context for the discussion today. So thank you, Val. Thank you, Stephen. So I'm going to introduce the panelists that we have with us today. First, I'm going to introduce Paul Martin, who is born and raised in southern Saskatchewan. Paul's work has been seen and heard in the province's media since the early 70s, which is no comment on his age, just his what's the word I'm looking for? Proclivity. There we go, proclivity. And specializing in coverage of the business and political scenes. His career has spanned radio, television, and print and electronic media. Today, he's a partner in Martin Charlton Communications, which is a PR firm that provides services to a variety of both public and private clients from Canada and actually around the world, and really has focused a lot of his attention on CEO and executive development, working with many dozens of leaders in the provincial business community here in Saskatchewan to help sharpen their skills through Tech Canada. And he's an active member of the Saskatchewan business community, as chair of the board of directors for Desneti, and a member of the board of GenSource Potash, and a former board chair of the Regina Regional Economic Development Authority. So Paul, thanks for joining us today. Next, I want to introduce Brian Dilling. Brian is the Director of Planning and the Acting Director of Investment Attraction within the Economic Development Division of the Ministry of Trade and Export Development. So you can't talk economic or investment attraction without talking to Brian. And he has worked for the government of Saskatchewan for 16 years in a variety of roles. Prior to joining the government of Saskatchewan, he worked in construction and in manufacturing, so he's got a private sector background. And he has a BA degree in history from the University of Calgary and an MBA from University of Saskatchewan. So thank you, Brian. Joanne, it looks like you have a beagle in the back. Is that a beagle or a basset hound? Either way, gorgeous dog. So next is Joanne. Joanne is the Director of Business Development with the Saskatoon Regional Economic Development Authority. She's a highly skilled certified treasury professional with extensive experience in economic development and financial risk management. During various times at SRETA, she's provided director leadership for the business attraction, the business expansion, the economic intelligence, regional, indigenous economic reconciliation, and entrepreneurship pillars. So really across all of the areas that SRETA focuses on. But prior to joining SRETA, Joanne spent many years with international uranium mining companies, Cameco Corporation, and Uraners. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. You'll have to pronounce it for me, Joanne. Exploration mining, but so it also comes from the private sector background and was an integral part of Cameco's treasury team, providing oversight for day-to-day treasury functions, as well as being a financial advisor on cross-functional acquisition teams. Joanne, thanks for joining us today. Next, we have John Lee, who is the president and CEO of Economic Development Regina. John is often quoted as saying that passion drives community, and throughout his career, he's really been able to witness how Regina has built big thinking businesses, organizations, and world-class events. He attributes the success of organizations that he's led to the capacity of for all these sectors to come together, to work together and rally around a purpose. I would attribute a lot of the success of those organizations to John's ability to lead organizations to do those things, but of course he's too humble to say that himself. And he thrives on the collaborative aspect of his work, believing that cultures rooted in purpose generate success. And he says that EDR is a team that is building community rooted in economic growth, and that's how we'll define success. It's that spirit that drives him and the energy and vitality of the Regina region that inspires him. Last but certainly not least, I want to introduce our moderator for today's session, my friend Shelley Thiel. Shelley is the CEO of the Institute of Chartered Professional Accountants of Saskatchewan. CPA Saskatchewan is the regulatory body for professional accountants in the province. And in her role, she works extensively with her national and regional colleagues. She is a member of the board of directors of the CPA Western School of Business, as well as a member of the audit committee. And she's a member of the board of the South Saskatchewan Community Foundation and chair of their finance committee. Shelley lives in Regina with her husband, and they have 4 kids. Shelley is also a member of the Saskatchewan Business Council, where I sit. That's how I got to know her, and I was really delighted when she accepted our invitation to moderate this panel today on investment attraction. So with that, I'm going to be quiet, Shelley, turn it over to you and let you and our illustrious guests tell us about what's going on with investment attraction in Saskatchewan.
Great, thanks so much, Mark. And welcome to everyone who's joined. I think we've got a good group of attendees, and we've got an absolutely awesome panel who are going to share their wisdom with all of us. So it should be a good couple of hours that we have together. Just a reminder to all of the participants, if you do have questions, please put those in the chat so that we can see them. We will try to address all questions. Don't feel you need to wait until the end to put your questions in. We'll try to address those as we go through where possible. Ideally, we want to focus the discussion on what you're interested in hearing. So feel free to put questions in, even if you don't feel that they're completely relevant to what's being talked about at that point. We will make sure we get to those questions and try to address all of those. I think we're off to a good start with Val and Stephen's presentation. Certainly a good backdrop for the conversation, and certainly triggers some thought and some comments there. Both John and Paul did ask a question, so I thought maybe I'd start just by asking the other 2 panelists if you have any comments, anything stood out to you from the presentation. So perhaps let's start with Joanne. Anything in that presentation that you wanted to highlight or comment on?
Yes, I was just going to maybe quickly mention about the international immigration piece, which I was a little bit surprised that it was still increasing throughout the pandemic. And then the indication that housing starts and population are going to continue to significantly increase over the coming years. And I didn't get the chance to ask Val, but I'm assuming that that is still related to that international immigration piece.
Great, thanks, Joanne. Brian, do you have anything you want to add?
I just had one observation or one comment. I was intrigued by the slide on manufacturing shipments. And in the early days of the pandemic last year, one of the things we were really worried about was how it was going to impact our manufacturing sector. And we were pleasantly surprised to see that for the most part, the sector kind of held its own. We had a number of companies that were able to pivot and start making materials that were needed in pandemic response and kind of adapted that way. And then, you know, certainly there was a decline, but it wasn't a devastating thing for the industry. So that was good. That was nice to see that slide. And then the fact that our exports remain strong, it really emphasizes the byline that the government uses. You know, we have what the world needs. And that continues to be true despite the pandemic. So if we can have the transportation networks and everything working, you know, we continue to pull through these sorts of challenges in good form.
Great, thanks, Brian. Also makes me think it'll be nice going forward when we can have some of these conversations without having to refer to the pandemic or COVID in every second sentence that we speak about. I think we're getting close there. So let's switch gears slightly. We just ask the panelists, from your perspectives, what are some of the unique and interesting trends that you're seeing emerging in Saskatchewan's private sector? So perhaps we'll start with John for that one.
Sure, just a few things that come to mind, and some of them are sort of ones that are fairly obvious, but it's going to be really interesting to watch how businesses are actually set up going forward, office spaces and adjusting to the post-COVID world. And I know all kinds of folks are speculating exactly how that's going to unfold, but I don't think most of us really know, you know, flex schedules, do people work from home, combination thereof, how's that's going to impact inventory around businesses and business spaces in our downtowns and those kinds of things. So that one obviously is one that's emerging and will play out. We wear two hats in our organization and are quite involved in the tourism world, and as most folks know, the tourism and hospitality industry, and that was shown in the slides presented by Val and Stephen, it has had huge impacts. And one of the concerns in terms of is on the labor front, where and we're hearing this that you know, restaurants and some of the hospitality sector actually can't find employees to work with a fairly significant escalation of getting back into business. So those are a couple of things. Couple that with the fact there's some really interesting challenges locally on local retail competing with the big guys. We're hearing more and more, and Paul actually commented on this in one of his commentaries. There's traceability, inventory management locally, and the ability for local retail companies to even provide product when in fact you can get on Amazon and it's delivered 24 hours to your house. So there are a lot of emerging more local issues that I'm sort of speaking to here. So those are some of the emerging things that come to mind, and there's some bigger ones around technology and traceability and those kinds of things.
Thanks, John. Paul, do you want to go next?
Absolutely. Thanks very much, and hi to everybody. For me, the primary trend that I'm seeing right now as a commentator observer is we are already in Saskatchewan Boom 2.0, and I think it's been kind of understated. And even, you know, it was the source of my comment from, you know, to Stephen and Val about how much has changed since the 1st of January in this year. We're seeing significant increases in commodities. It first was reported by JP Morgan Chase back in January that we're entering a super cycle of commodities. There's some debate about whether that is, but they were the first ones to put the flag up. And there's been a lot of suggestion to reinforce that. Now, whether it's a super cycle or just an upcycle, that's a debating point. But if you look at it from purely empirical numbers, I mean, $70 oil, we're seeing $25 flax a couple of weeks ago, $20 canola. I mean, anybody who grew up on a farm, you tell me when you saw $20 canola straight from the combine. I mean, this is unprecedented territory. Uranium production is beginning again. We're seeing the reopening of the mines after the industry showed remarkable discipline in being able to curtail production to match supply and demand. We're seeing potash increases now. We're starting to see both price increases and output increases. And that's just been accelerated in the last little bit by the international sanctions on Belarus, was the primary competitor for potash production, and that idea they had to take down that airplane with the journalist on it has sparked all kinds of retaliation, particularly from the Europeans, and potash has been one of the things that's been affected. So we're starting to see increased growth. And if you look at the food, fuel, and fertilizer, the 3 Fs of Saskatchewan, I just covered them, and they're all in ascension. And as I pointed to earlier, you had made 80% on the price of, on Cameco stock, which is a proxy for uranium prices. And now we're seeing investments start to flow in, and that surprises me. Actually, the one slide that I'm pleasantly surprised at is how much capital investment is being targeted for the province. And we're seeing it like these recent announcements with canola crushing, with the fiber board, and you're seeing the helium operation, lithium, the DEEP project. I mean, and if you go look up north right now, the activity going on in northern Saskatchewan in exploration and development of mining properties is off the charts. And I saw a piece the other day, they were talking about that L'Orange area being the next big gold belt in Canada. So we're not usually talked about as a gold producer. Yeah, we've got a mine, but all of a sudden now it's of interest, and there's probably 10 or 15 uranium projects, moving along pretty well. So there's an awful lot of stuff going on here. Cobalt's being talked about now, that they're active chasing. So my primary observation, we're in Saskatchewan Boom 2.0, and I will remind you of an old economic development proverb. John and Joanne, you'll know this one. People follow opportunity. And there's usually, if you looked at what happened in Saskatchewan Boom 1.0, the investment started to flow in Saskatchewan in 2004, and the population began to move in 2006. So it's about an 18 to 24 month lag. So what you're seeing now with this capital flowing in here takes 18 months for people to figure out where the opportunity is, sell their house and relocate. And it's a lot of it's driven around construction activity. And so, if we have a conversation about, say, the BHP mine and it's what it's going to do to construction, but just think about all the activity that's been announced, even in the last 2 months, of about $2 billion worth of canola crushing and fiberboard. And we're all hearing about new projects all over the place, which we weren't even 6 or 8 months ago. So capital is starting to flow. And so those are the two big things for me. Saskatchewan's a commodity-driven economy. Commodities are taking off. You usually think of a 15-year cycle, 7 up, 7 down. The price of potash and oil crashed in November 2014. So do the math. That's 7 years ago. And we're into a 7-year upcycle, and we're at the very beginning of it.
Great, thanks, Paul. Joanne, any comments?
That was great, Paul. Thank you very much for reinforcing everything that we're seeing and hearing. So that's good. I knew you would be bringing all that to the table, so I thought I'd talk about something a little bit different. Entrepreneurship. We are seeing entrepreneurship staying strong. Between March 2020 and 21, the Square One's team in Sreda logged 4,280 unique interactions. We're also seeing the transition to more online presence for our local entrepreneurs, which is not surprising given the year that we've had. And the flight to new technology and online presence will provide them with the ability to increase market exposure post-pandemic. The other area that we're seeing increases in, and I think John mentioned, was around manufacturing sector, food processing, things like that are showing increases even throughout this past pandemic year. And then the other interesting one is the Saskatchewan-owned craft brewing companies. They seem to be sprouting up everywhere, and they seem to be expanding and developing. So we've seen some expansion here in Saskatoon, but we're also hearing about future expansion to come.
Thanks, Joanne. Brian, comments you might have, and I guess, from a government perspective or just overall as well.
Thank you, Shelley. I had a couple of thoughts. The first, when we talk about trends that we're seeing in the private sector, one of the things that we see companies that we're working with, potential investors, looking for more and more is Saskatchewan's responsiveness to environment, social, and governance issues, ESG, particularly when we're looking at companies from Europe. We have had instances in the not too far distant past where we've lost potential investments in the province to other areas because our source of electricity was not as green as the competitor, So those are trends that are becoming more prominent, I would say, and something that we need to definitely be aware of. And it extends too to the suppliers and contractors that would build the facility. If we can demonstrate that we're acting or doing our work sustainably and ethically and all those kinds of things, it's an important thing that shouldn't be overlooked. I was also thinking about the labor shortage that's been mentioned. And job vacancies reported in the construction sector in Saskatchewan. The other thing that kind of piggybacks on that is that many of our workers in the construction area are aging. We need to be concerned about new people coming into the trades and into the sector in order to have a strong industry that can get the projects built as they come in. And then the other trend that I wanted to talk about just briefly was automation and artificial intelligence. It's impacting a lot of industries. We see it, of course, with self-driving cars and farm equipment. It's also in the mining sector, but also should not be ignored in terms of the construction sector. There are companies that are producing self-driving construction equipment, and then drones and sensors that relay information about, pieces of equipment and stuff. All those kinds of things can contribute to safety and productivity on the job site, and those will impact the construction sector here too as well. So those are some of the trends that I was thinking of.
Shelley, I wonder if I could comment on the ESG piece that Brian brought up.
Yeah.
I'm hearing it too, and as you heard in the introduction, I was a board member of GenSource. I'm since retired. I guess I should have updated that. I'm not on that board anymore, but I can tell you, we were pursuing building a mine, or are pursuing building a mine in the Moose Jaw, Tegaski area, and in working with Europeans in particular, the financial community, when they were doing due diligence, ESG, environmental, social governance, is very high on their priority list, certainly ahead of legal and those things. But the other thing I'm seeing is that principally because of that European push, so much of ESG is really around E. It's around climate change, and the S part, the social stuff, in which Saskatchewan is a global leader. And we don't talk about this, but you think about the Beta Commission report of 45 years ago. That's the piece that set the tone for the world. And we never talk about that, but there is no jurisdiction in North America that doesn't draw its environmental policy from the Beta Commission, which was about uranium development in Saskatchewan. And you see what happened in northern Saskatchewan with the Cameco particularly, but all the uranium companies having to work so closely with the local community. And that social piece is very empowering, but they don't get any credit for it. And I think we as a province need to stand up and make some noise that there's more to ESG than just climate change. There is the impact at the local level for communities and regional benefits and these kinds of things, of which we are pioneers. And actually, to be honest with you, I don't think there's anybody on the planet who's as far ahead as we are on this, and we aren't singing the song very well.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I think Paul and Brian, you both sort of led into perhaps the next question I have. Paul led into it from the positive perspective, some of the opportunities, and perhaps, I think we're well known in Saskatchewan for selling ourselves a bit short and not perhaps speaking too highly of ourselves. And Brian, you spoke a little bit about potential loss of investments to other jurisdictions. So I guess obviously one of the keys is to ensure that Saskatchewan is the place that people want to invest. So I would love to hear your comments on how we can attract investors to Saskatchewan and what we can do to keep them here. And perhaps we'll start with just some overall comments. And I think Mark has a question that I think will tie into this as well. So perhaps this time, let's start with Joanne, if that works for you.
Sure. So when we're talking about exciting opportunities, I think in the Saskatoon region, we are looking at, we have a growing tech sector and organizations such as CoLabs helping to support this. But we now have a second incubator accelerator program specific to the agri-food industry starting up in Saskatoon, and it's the Global Agri-Food Accelerator Partnership, or GAP. And it'll support new local startups in the agri-food sector, as well as attract international startups to learn more about the benefits of scaling up in the Saskatoon region. So SREET is involved in this through our Voyage program, where we are going to go out and introduce this to the world and hopefully bring in some international companies for it. But through this, once we've got startups going within the province, then they can grow and develop and grow into larger processing facilities, etc. So, and more news in this area is we've also started a Saskatoon food and ingredient processing cluster here in the Saskatoon region. So another area where we're continuing to try and work on that ag value added piece. So the other one that I did want to talk about, and I'm sure someone else is going to catch this one as well, is the opportunities for Indigenous engagement and partnerships. Saskatoon set the standard for urban reserves in Canada, and we continue to support Indigenous economic development with new urban reserves, which we currently are up to 8 right now, and we have 17 Indigenous organizations with land holdings in the region, which will work to support Indigenous economic reconciliation in the future. So a big area for our future in the Saskatoon region.
Thanks, Joanne. John, do you want to pick up on that?
Sure. I'm going to just connect a little bit more in a broader level to something Paul said. So part of it is learning from, if 7 years ago plus we were in a boom stage and everybody was talking about the new normal, and then the new normal really didn't continue. What have we learned from that? And here we are again, and there's a significant amount of momentum. There's lots of great stories. We're hearing from Toronto what's going on in Saskatchewan. And to me, a lot of this comes back to how we actually brand and promote our province, but also how we, of course, in our case, brand and market our cities. And generally, we've done a poor job of that. And I think we have a very unique opportunity as private sector, economic development agencies, government, to really figure out how we're going to do a much better job of promoting what we have, what's going on, and the potential for the future is. And that requires investments from government into destination marketing, investment attraction, those kinds of things. So there's an incredible amount of momentum right now that we've got to exploit and take advantage of. And I also believe there's some really unique opportunities where we've got to perhaps work a little better together and understand that there are certain assets in the province that are good for all of us. And while we're advancing fairly aggressively an ag and food strategy within the Greater Regina region, it's built on some of our strengths, but at the same time, we're talking about the fact that Saskatoon and the University of Saskatchewan has world-leading research, and that's an asset that should attract you to Saskatchewan. So I would argue we've got to do a better job of coordinating our efforts. We all have the same outcomes, and we just need to start to look at how better we can look at these exciting opportunities, particularly in the ag and food space, the tech space. They're all interconnected, and we just have an incredible opportunity. So that's sort of my comments or observations on that one.
Thanks, John. Brian, do you want to add your comments?
Sure, thanks, Shelley. So the question, how do we attract investors and how do we keep them here? I mean, it comes down to simply investors will come and stay here because they see an opportunity to make money here, right? And if that's not there, well, it doesn't matter kind of what we do. But in terms of that, anything that we can do, and this is reflected from the companies that we work with who want to build, industrial sites. Anything that we can do to keep the front end costs down make a big difference on the return on investment in a project like that. So when we look at the cost of supplying utility connections and things like that, it all plays into it. We have to try to keep the front end costs down wherever we can. Certainly there are implications around that for the construction sector. It calls on them to be really efficient and productive and stuff, and make sure that they're doing what they can to keep the costs down. And also thinking of themselves more as part of a project team instead of on a transactional basis, that they're going to just build this and get paid and they're gone. I think we need to think a little more broadly and consider what we can do to help these companies to be successful when they come and make investments. From a government point of view, of course, we have to watch the regulatory burden, tax rates, make sure that we're doing what we can to provide a skilled labor force, have a good training system in place, all those kinds of things. And like John mentioned, working together with partners like EDR and SREDA and the other regions with the provincial government ministries. One other thing that maybe I'll just point out is that we sometimes have a lack of good local partners for companies to co-invest with. Often if we're dealing with a foreign company, it's a scary thing to invest a big sum of money in a country where you're unfamiliar with the ground or the situation on the ground. And it really helps if we have a good local partner who can join with them in a project. We need to develop that. That would help us. And then the building out the whole supply chain. We've talked quite a bit about some of the major agri-food investments and value-added ag processing opportunities. But those opportunities produce byproducts. Like if you're talking about pea protein or something like that, it produces a lot of starch as a byproduct. So we also need to have companies come in that can make use of that starch for other products, and build up a whole supply chain and kind of cluster around that. That will help to keep those investments here as well. One of the things I'll just quickly mention that we are working on that is really foreign to my way of thinking anyway, but fly production, insect production for protein. So we can take starch from the pea protein operations and other facilities, and that becomes food for the flies and the other grubs that would be grown, and then they feed into the aquaculture market, right? Things like that. So we could tie that into aquaculture, and there's a chain of connections there that we need to strengthen.
Thanks. As long as you're developing flies and not mosquitoes, we'll probably be okay. You don't need any more of those these days. Paul, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would just say that there's going to be an awful lot of canola meal around this province too, after we had 4 new canola crushing plants. But just build on a few things that I heard here, and I think part of it is a philosophical approach for the province. I don't think we put enough emphasis on having corporate headquarters here, and just how important having decision makers resident in the province. I had opportunity in my career to write a couple of books, one on IPSCO, one on the Hill family in Regina. And part of the interviews that I did in leading up to that were with Peter Lougheed before he passed away. And it was a real point for him. And I got to spend a lot of time talking about it. And he said, basically he was sick and tired of decisions being made in Toronto that affected his province. And so he started to say, I'm moving corporate headquarters here. It wasn't an easy overnight thing. No, it was a long-term process, but it started with the declaration by the premier or the government that this was a priority. And ultimately they moved CP Rail and Imperial Oil and, lots of big ones. And even Crown Life, he commented to me on that he was glad to see it leave Toronto. Would he liked it in Calgary rather than Regina? Yes, but he was happy to see it come out of Toronto because it gave the West more economic clout. So let's start with thinking about what do we need to do to get corporate headquarters. So one of the pieces you may want to think about that is around tax rates, provincial tax rates, and we can't affect the federal rate, but they're also neutral because every province has the same federal tax rate. So what if we said we want the lowest provincially, the lowest personal income tax rate in the country? That would attract certain decision makers here. If you sold your company in Toronto, your advisors would have to tell you, I mean, Shelley, you'd know this, the CPAs in Toronto would have to advise, move to Saskatchewan to execute the transaction because that's the lowest tax jurisdiction. Well, that's great. You get them one-off, but what if you said to it, let's complement that by once you've paid $1 million in provincial income tax in Saskatchewan, you're done. That's enough. And then the only way they could continue to be tax-free would be to reside in Saskatchewan. You'd become the Switzerland of Canada. All the money would move here and their people. So you wouldn't tax those folks. And there's, we could have a debate about that. And I'm sure that those, on the opposition side of the house would say, are you kidding? You're not going to tax the richest guys? I'd say, yeah, because they paid enough. And you could do the math on that if you want. But all of their people, advisors, their staff, all of that would then have to follow that capital. And so I just think we sometimes don't get creative enough in what we're talking about in terms of the instruments that we use. And I would just one more thing, and it really, since I know we're talking to construction people today, this will fit for you guys. And it fits a little bit in the Buy Saskatchewan notion of, for public sector procurement, it strikes me that we don't look at the whole value project, the whole project value, sorry. If you're SaskPower and you're going to build a project, you look at the bids and you take the lowest rate possible. But if you're the Minister of Finance, a shareholder of SaskPower, you got a different perspective. You've got money going out through SaskPower, but you've got money coming in from all the tax that project will attract. That's the income tax for staff, there's corporate tax, sales tax, all of that stuff. That should be the equation that we use to balance or to price that project, not the bid ultimately, but really how much are you putting back in? So that would give an advantage to all Saskatchewan companies because their corporate tax would then be included in here. If you're a company that's non-resident in the province, you would lose that. And it would be non-discriminatory and I suspect would stand up pretty well under New West. And if a company from Alberta or Ontario complained about it, you say, no problem, just move your headquarters here and you'll be in on the track. And so I think, part of it is we need, John's point was very, very valid, that we don't sell this stuff very well as a city, a province, or a region. And so we need to promote that a little bit. But first, we need something to sell. And I think we've got some opportunities and maybe we need to be a little bit creative. Alberta used to be the lowest tax jurisdiction in the country, and they had this address of convenience where somebody would sell a company in Toronto, relocate to Calgary for December 31st of that year. The Alberta government provided nothing, no health care, no roads, no anything to that people, but got this gift of thousands or millions of dollars of tax revenue. Well, why wouldn't we grab that? We have the lowest debt to GDP ratio of all the provinces. We have the best balance sheet. We're in the best position to do it. We just need to make that decision and then start to sell it.
And I wouldn't mind just a little contrarian perspective to Paul's. It's contrary, but it's also picking up a little bit on Joanne's comment on entrepreneurship. Chasing head offices is tough work, and I think we absolutely need to look at how we go about doing that. But the other perspective is you grow an ecosystem locally that really supports local companies and people. You actually can grow head offices locally that stay here and can become international. We've got lots of examples of that, whether it's AGT or whatever, right? So part of the challenge is I don't know if our ecosystem, we've got a ton of great things going on right now with Joanne's mentioned them in Saskatoon. In terms of supporting the ecosystem, and you also, investment attraction for us is also about attracting investment to grow local companies and wrapping your arms around them. And in lots of cases, you're actually going to create head offices that that stay here because their roots are here. So, and I think that's part of the creative perspective I think Paul is talking about. We really do need to think about this differently. And in some cases, I think head offices are going to want to come here. But on the other hand, we can, and it's actually easier in economic development to work with what you have versus bringing things here. That is tough slugging. And, but we still need to do it. So there's two parts to that, I would argue.
I would agree with you. It's not an easy thing. And as I said, even Lougheed said it was a 20-year plan. But, one of the forces that's at work here that is working in our favor on this one is First Nations. As companies get mature and founders are looking to sell, and this becomes one of the challenges is succession, is there's not a very big buyer pool in Saskatchewan. Often it's the Alberta companies or the Ontario ones or Americans who come in and buy our really good, highly productive companies. And because they see really good companies, right? Well, now we're seeing First Nations buy them and keep those headquarters here. And, good example, Joanna BJ&E in Saskatoon. I mean, that company, beautiful firm, right? Would have been a real candidate to be purchased by somebody out of Fort Mac or Edmonton or something like that. And instead, it was a couple of First Nations who stepped up, bought the company and kept the headquarters here. So there's a force that's coming into play in the province that I think gets underestimated. And I see it as a real influencer and a real positive development. But I would play both at the same time, John. I would do the growth from within is cool, but, Joanne, John, you both know the reality of your life. Your budgets are funded by politicians, and politicians need ribbon cutting. And build from within does not get you a ribbon cutting. Bringing somebody in from the outside is sexy, and they can say, look at my community, so beautiful, somebody would leave where they live and come here. That's what politicians need, and you're going to get forced into the investment attraction game, whether you like it or not. So deal with it. And all I'm saying is, take these concepts that are a little bit edgy and set yourself apart. I would add one more. Give $25 million to each campus and say, go find the best researcher in the world, in the case of the U of S, in physics, around synchrotron, and in biotech and ag, and in Regina around water and environment and energy, and say, buy them. Buy the best researchers in the world. And what happens? All the talent follows them. The grad students, and then look at what happened in Saskatoon. And you got the best ag guys going, and all of a sudden, every biotech company in the country came and set up. What did we have to do? Put the infrastructure of greenhouses in place. Now Saskatoon became one of the leading biotech players on the continent. It all started from the university. Well, Regina could do the same thing, I would argue, and I think we can do more of that around the assets that we have. And John, the work you guys did with the pursuit that's going on right now for the Canada Water Agency, perfect example of that. And that you're taking the horsepower that's at the two campuses in Regina, at First Nations and at U of R, and the old PFRA legacy, and you're saying, let's build around that and let's start to create a cluster kind of down the street from the protein cluster, which is in Regina, which is built exactly the same way on knowledge.
Great, thanks, Paul. Joanne, I'd just like to pick up on John's comment about building from within as opposed to bringing from elsewhere. You did comment on collabs. I'm just wondering if you could expand a little bit about collabs, explain what it is and where you see the opportunities there, because I think that fits very well with John's comments or the building within, because I think there have been some great opportunities, and I think there's not a chance to go even further with that. But I'm not sure everyone's completely aware of the opportunities that are there. If you could just share about that.
Yeah, Collabs is an incubator accelerator program in Saskatoon at Innovation Place. It's actually funded by Innovation Saskatchewan, which is funded by the provincial government. So they do a lot of work. They bring in several new small tech companies every year, and they help them through I believe they have and I'll get the names wrong probably, but they have a launch program, and then they move them up into, higher levels of acceleration. They help them to look for that initial funding that they need to get started. And, I don't have the numbers, and maybe Brian does have them, but, there have been so many good good startups come out of collabs. And when you think about other companies in Saskatoon, like Vendesta is a very good example of a startup tech company in Saskatoon that has done amazing things. And for anyone who watched, it's called United the Prairies conference last week, Brendan King was on there, and he's co-founder of Vendesta. And the one comment that he made is, if you want to keep people for 5-10 years, you want to make sure that they have a place where they can raise a family. There are some very serious advantages if you want to go right away and go fast in the Valley ecosystem. But there are other advantages if you want to try and build something for a long-term period, like places in Saskatchewan. So, and we know what they have done and what they've committed to for Saskatchewan and Saskatoon. So nice to see that there are techs that start up here and continue to grow here through programs like collabs.
Thanks, Joanne. I know Mark has a question, and I could summarize his question, but perhaps Mark, I'll just turn it over to you to ask your question, and then we can respond to that.
Sure, thanks, Shelley. And maybe it touches on the point that Paul made about ribbon cutting, and I don't think there's any bigger ribbon to be cut in terms of what, a long-standing investment opportunity that's been talked about here in Saskatchewan, which is the BHP mine. I'm hearing that I think it's a widely held secret that the decision is supposed to be coming relatively soon, the end of the summer here, for whether the board and whether they're going to be proceeding with the investment, that their internal rate of return numbers are marginal, or at least at this point. I mean, that may depend a lot on where commodity prices go in the longer term, and that they've asked for things like PST reduction and things like that, or a rebate, and that so far at least they've been met with some resistance to that from the government. And so my question is not whether or not that's the right decision for government to make. I think I have sort of two parts to the question. The first part is challenging decisions for governments to make, right? How do you weigh and balance the calculus of providing incentives to companies to come and invest here, and balancing the needs of the taxpayer more generally, and the needs of the public coffers more generally? And so that would be part one. And part two of the question is, let's go forward, think into the future a little bit, that BHP decides not to proceed. Hopefully that won't be the case, but if they choose not to proceed, what that may mean for, I'm going to say, for the psyche of Saskatchewan. I'm not sure that that's the right word, but I'd just like to get your take, everybody's take on those two parts. So how do governments balance the priorities they have to do with providing incentives versus the greater public issues of the public coffer? And two, what would a decision like that one from BHP mean for Saskatchewan?
Great, thanks, Mark. Brian, I hate to put you on the spot, but do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Well, those are good questions and difficult questions. When, in response to the first part, I think how a government would have to weigh that in the balances, it requires a long-term view, and that's often difficult for a government to do, right? Because they think in terms of election cycles. So, yeah, I guess somehow we just need to demonstrate the long-term value of having that company, that investment happen here versus whatever revenue the government might give up in the near term. But the challenging thing about that too, though, is the issue of fairness. The BHP, of course, would not be the only potash company in the province. And how do you justify giving them a significant advantage over their competitors who are already here and have been operating for decades in some cases, So that, I think, becomes a stumbling block too when you think of giving preferential treatment to a company like BHP. And to be honest, I'm not sure which side of the line I would come down on in that particular case. It's just really, really difficult. And I understand how the elected officials would struggle with a question like that. And then the second part of your company is what next, you know, if BHP decides not to go ahead. And although that's certainly not what would be the preferable outcome, I think, the asset is still there. And ultimately, I think what would happen is that it would probably be sold to a competitor at a reduced rate. If they can get into it at a lower rate, then suddenly the internal return becomes a lot better, and somebody else might be able to go ahead with the project if they could get it at a bargain price. We know that the demand for potash is going to be there. Like, I think ultimately the supply is going to be needed. It may just be, yeah, that the numbers don't work at this level, right? And so I know that there were some discussions about partnering with BHP. Whether or not those will come about, I don't know. It may be that some of the other companies are just holding back and saying, well, look, if they don't go ahead, then we can get it at a bargain basement price and it'll work out better for us. So let's not invest in it right now. So I don't know. I think long-term, the asset is still going to be there. And I think somebody will develop it at some point in time, regardless of what happens right now. That's my thought.
Thanks. John, do you have a perspective?
Oh, that's a little bit of a hot potato, I would say, in some ways. But you know,
Well, you just saw how Brian did such a skillful job of walking the line.
Exactly.
You can do it too, John.
Yeah. Well, or not. You know, I think this isn't just a BHP question for all of us, right? The challenge we all have is when we look in Manitoba and Alberta, there are lots of incentives and initiatives, particularly around utilities and those kinds of things that are very hard to compete with. So the reality is, regardless of ideology and policy, that's what we're faced with. And in my view, we're losing out on things. So we got to figure part of this out at a real high level for me. And I think we all have a responsibility for this, and to help government is, we got to bring some more clarity around the outcomes. At the end of the day, it's quality of life, healthcare, schools, all the great things. And we got to help the public understand that in order to do that, you got to generate revenue. And ultimately that's through jobs and job creation. And I actually think economic development and economic growth is a very misunderstood item in our province and locally and those kinds of things. So, you know, I think ultimately it is how we build a stronger business case that's balanced to ensure that we actually keep the BHPs and those kinds of companies here and attract new companies, but also grow from within. So it really is misunderstood depending on who you're talking about, and folks understanding in order to generate tax revenue, we need more jobs and we need companies growing from within and attracting new companies into our province. So I think we all have a responsibility as well to sort of help government figure this out, and really advocate for a business model that makes sense. So that's just sort of some thoughts that I can share on that.
Thanks, John. Joanne, do you have anything to add?
I'll just maybe add that I agree that fairness is an issue. I think there's lots of exploration going on in the potash industry and other industries in the province. And so once you open the door to an incentive, it has to be for everyone. So it's tough to do that. We do want the jobs, we want the expansion and the growth here. But we've recently heard that, you know, there's been discussions with nutrients. So does a joint venture come out of this? Does something else happen that doesn't involve government intervention, which would be maybe a better way of handling this issue? So I think that's my thought, that we'd love to see them here. We'd love to see them expand here. They put, what, $4+ billion into this. I don't think they're walking away with zero. Somebody will develop someday, and hopefully sooner rather than later.
Thanks, Joanne. Paul?
Yeah, a couple of points. One is on the fairness thing. I mean, this government provides an incentive for mining development in every sector except potash. So for those of us who've been trying to build a small junior potash company here, we've been discriminated against compared to all other forms of mining. So, you know, the fairness thing to me is moot. Governments are really quite willing to pick and choose winners, despite the fact that they say they don't. So, you know, that aside, I guess ultimately it comes down to this. What's the vision for the province? Are we about growth, or are we about preserving the balance sheet, or are we about just, you know, not providing, not going to spend in the private sector? I don't know. If it is about growth, and I think back to when Brad Wall got elected, it was a growth agenda. And cabinet can make decisions on the basis of this item you're asking me to approve is going to result in growth, yes or no? And if the answer is going ahead with a tax incentive to create growth at a mining project, then answer that question. But it starts with the vision. And we don't have a vision. You know, we have a growth targets and stuff like that, but I don't know if we have a real plan. And I come back to something that scared the hell out of me last fall, and it centers around population. When the two airports came under scrutiny, is losing the international status, and Regina even more so with the threat of losing air traffic control. That's a population item, pure and simple. If we had another 1 million people in Saskatchewan, we would not have that conversation. We wouldn't even have been on the agenda. To me, it just starts with, what do we need to do to get another 1 million people here? And so there's going to be a focus around immigration. There's got to be a focus around, if they land here, what are they going to do? Well, we better get some investment flowing into the province. And so I would start with the vision piece, and then ask yourself whether or not BHP fits into that thing. Does it result in what you're trying to achieve? And if your growth is, we're just happy at 1 million people and we're going to close the door and leave it here the way it is, to quote somebody from the 70s in this province, we'll leave it in the ground for our children's children. That's one decision. But if you are about growth, then that maybe changes the complexion of the discussion that you have. And I think we got to start with informing ourselves with a grand strategy first. Because to pick this one off, it's like all those other ones we're talking about picking winners and losers. And we know about the rhetoric around that in Saskatchewan. So let's stop picking winners and losers. Let's start to talk about what's the vision. If it's 2, 3, 5 million people, and go back to Walter Scott. He envisioned 10 million people living on the banks of the South Saskatchewan River. Well, we have not done a very good job of living up to our first premier's vision of what Saskatchewan could be. And that guy suffered from mental health issues. So you can talk about that too, if you know, maybe he was just delusional. But on the other side, there are many of us who believe that's actually doable. And, you know, you see decisions that are kind of leading towards that. Maybe we need irrigation and some of this stuff. So we tinker and we play around it. I would just like to see us set an agenda that said it's all about a target of 5 million people and its growth. And then we never have to worry about whether we fill a hockey stadium or a football arena, or have an airport that's viable.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, I think Mark, probably some good comments there. Certainly a lot of comments around, I think the key thing I heard really throughout was all around fairness. That is the piece that has to be managed, and what will really get us to that long-term vision, the growth vision. So let's just switch gears a little bit. There has been some very specific work done around agribusiness, and certainly in Val and Stephen's presentation did speak about some of the impacts there. So Joanne, can you tell us about Project Ribbon and what this might mean for Saskatchewan?
Sure. So Project Ribbon is a long-term agribusiness attraction strategy. Street has been working on this since 2016 with the assistance of a local stakeholder group here. And it's a 3-phase project. Phase 1 focused on location analysis to determine the Saskatoon region areas that were better prepared to attract agribusiness development. So when we talk about this, we're talking about the large utility users, the ones that need specific water treatment that's maybe beyond what we currently have, water usage beyond what we have. I think somebody made reference to Roquette earlier in the discussion. It's that type of a business we're looking for. So we looked at labor, rail, highways, utilities, and on with the avoidance of environmentally protected lands. And so at the end of phase one, we came up with a heat map that showed 3 nodes within the Saskatoon region that were better than other areas or better along the preparedness line to do this type of business attraction work and get them further to cross the goal line to where a company could walk in and say, okay, this is what you have. This is, this is what we need to do to get over the finish line. So phase 2 was the cost analysis piece. We finished that this past March. And in phase 2, we worked with all 3 of our Crown utilities, as well as the City of Saskatoon, to determine a pricing model for each of those nodes. And it's not a specific point on the map as to it's this place or this lot of land. It's more around where in this area, what would it cost to bring the utilities to this area? So that was completed in March, and it's available on the Streeter website if anyone wants to take a look at that report and the numbers that came out of it. Phase 3 will include discussions with the 3 RMs involved. We've also reached out to Portage La Prairie, who is where Roquette eventually ended up, to maybe get a presentation from them and see how they did it, because theirs was a lot of work around uniting the RMs and getting everyone together. I think John mentioned how we have to work together better as a team, and I think this is maybe part of it. So we're working with the RMs. We're working with the organizations such as Crown Investments Corporation to find out what are the opportunities for financing utilities over the longer term for these types of projects. So that'll all come in phase 3. And then we're also looking for promotion, and we'll be looking for Brian's group to help in that area, as well as some of our federal counterparts such as Invest in Canada and Global Affairs Canada. So that's just a little bit of history, but lots to talk about in that area. So if anyone wants to learn more, let me know.
Thanks, Joanne. John, do you have anything to add from a Regina perspective?
Oh, pretty, I think I'm just thinking a little bit with Paul's comment on the vision thing. I couldn't agree more. And I think part of it is provincial vision, but then within our core regions, interconnecting the visions and layer that on strength-based thinking versus we're one big province and anything can go anywhere or whatever. I actually think that vision could, Regina or Southern Saskatchewan strength is sort of X and Y, Saskatoon and region is X and Y, and how do we interconnect that and then really move forward together to achieve that. So I couldn't agree more. You got to pick 2 or 3 maybe in terms of sort of where you really want to go, and then we get everybody sort of aligned and on the same bus. And I think one of the challenges, ag and food is absolutely, in my opinion, is but it's all interconnected. It's not like it's just ag and food, because as that sector grows, multiple sectors benefit from that. So we got to think about it a little bit differently. So, like Saskatoon, we've got a whole strategy. We're actually, we've got a private sector steering committee made up of our most senior CEOs advocating for that. And we're really now starting to just build off the momentum that's occurring right now in the province, and in particular around the Regina area with all the really neat announcements and a combination of local companies growing and making huge announcements, but also attracting companies like Redleaf into Regina. And that'll be Canada's first a pulp, non-wood pulp facility. And that took 2.5 years to really broker that one, and it took a lot of work. But the other point as to why companies are looking at Regina is actually a barrier we had was transportation logistics. Regina now has significant transportation logistics assets that are very attractive to companies, and that means now you can get product to market, and that's only going to grow as rail in particular starts to expand in the region. So ag and food is absolutely one of our core priorities. And I also just wanted to mention on the in terms of the ecosystem development, we of course have Connexus here, which has Cultivator, which is an accelerator. And last week we just made an announcement along with Connexus to create Canada's first venture-backed ag tech accelerator, which is all positioned to help companies that already are beyond the startup stage to help them escalate. And part of that will be to attract companies into Saskatchewan that hopefully will stay here and grow their companies as well. So, and I just love that partnership because it's led by a private sector partner, and organizations like ours and Innovation Saskatchewan can support it, but it really is being led by the private sector, and it's pretty exciting.
Great, thanks, John. I have a question that's a little more general, not specific to agribusiness, and perhaps Paul or Brian want to respond to this. In all of the conversation, I think so far, we've really focused on Regina and Saskatoon. So what about the rest of the province? How do we attract investment to other areas in the province? Because I feel the conversation's been very focused and you know, for good reason, but any comments on how we grow the rest of the province outside of the two major cities?
Are you throwing that to me first?
Yeah, either you or Brian. I think you're both unmuted, so whoever can get in first. Go ahead, Paul.
You know, to a degree, it really starts with the community itself having to put its hand up and say, pick me. And I think that's what's happening in Regina, Saskatoon. You know, a good example would be look at Yorkton and what they've done around canola crushing. They kind of just got ahead of the parade, and now they became an anchor to it. And so once you get a player in town, the chances of them expanding are much better than finding an alternate new player to come in and set up beside them. So, you know, I would say it starts with the community getting its head around this thing and putting its hand up first and saying, we are interested. And to John's point and Joanne's point on this is that figure out as a community, what is it that we actually bring to the parade? I think John made the comment that not everything fits interchangeably in all corners of Saskatchewan. So figure out what it is. You know, you want an example, go look at Tisdale, what they're doing around. They've got that infrastructure thing going with their transportation. And, you know, they kind of use the terms like a mini GTH and that kind of stuff. But they got a whole sector that's building around that. And I suspect every part of the province could do that. And it's just, you know, the community has to get its head around it first, and then start to mobilize the forces, and you can lean on the rest of the province to help you with that. But you got to start first with, we would welcome something if it came here.
Thanks, Paul. Anything to add, Brian?
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts. It's also important, and I totally agree with the comment that has been made, that not everything works in every location. If we're looking at a value-added ag processor, a food ingredients manufacturer, they generally need a lot of water, you know, and that's not always available, or at least it's not available at a reasonable cost, right? So the different regions of the province need to be realistic about what would work in their area, and then I totally agree as well about putting your hand up, you know, and letting the companies and investors know that you're there. Difficult to do with the limited budget of a small region, you know, so it's important to work with the other provincial players that are out there to try to make that happen. And then the other thing too is be welcoming to investment. We have had examples in the past where municipal councils pretty much try to offload taxes onto a processor that wants to build there, right? And that doesn't fly. You know, you have to keep costs reasonable and treat people equitably, or treat different types of industry equitably. Nothing will scare them away faster than, you know, crazy road levies or property taxes and things like that.
Maybe I just offer a comment. We have to be realize Regina and Saskatoon don't exist because of Regina and Saskatoon. We exist because the gold and the assets are actually around us. So you can't, if Regina or Saskatoon thinks about it just in their own domain, that makes no sense, because our ag and food strategy is all about Saskatchewan, southern Saskatchewan. Something that happens, you know, the Northgate announcement with canola crushing facility, or in Yorkton, that's all good for Regina and Saskatoon. As far as I know, there's 2 major airports. You got to come in, spend money, and all of those things make sense. So we do need to promote our regions and our province more integratedly, and because we got assets all over the place, and coordinate our efforts better. So that's the way we think about it. And my point earlier, you know, when we talk to companies or attracting, and you know, we talk a lot about the US and world leading ag research. That's gold, and it helps. So we just can't think about it as 2 urban cities. It really is about our regions or the province as a whole.
Yeah, thanks, John. Your comments, you've had a few comments, I think, today around collaboration. Certainly, you know, within the province, you know, amongst the various areas and the various players. But what do you see as some of the pieces that the private sector and the public sector can do together to try to achieve, you know, more success by having the public and the private sector working together? I know your organization does put heavy emphasis on that collaboration. So your thoughts on that collaboration between the 2 sectors?
Yeah, that is something we uphold pretty strongly here. And the reality is, particularly in economic development, the private sector ultimately has to lead this. Economic development agencies are more supportive, brokers, facilitators. Our organization actually, we're not 50% of our revenue actually comes from local government. The other 50% comes from the private sector. So we're very much have the private sector investing in what we do because they believe in what we do. But ultimately, it has to be led by, particularly with growing companies. Ultimately, private sector has to lead these things. But you know, whether it was the creation of our Audacity movement here in Regina, that was ultimately business people investing in the creation of it. Our investment partnership program, where private sectors actually invested heavily into our organization to help us reach our goals. But at the end of the day, it comes down to leadership and people working together. And while at times we say we do that well, I would suggest to you that we got some work to do as community leaders. And that, because we're small enough, that could be our competitive advantage over other cities, just putting aside some of our bias in certain cases and being more open to, you know what, maybe it should go in Saskatoon. That's okay if I'm from Regina, or whatever it is, and really try to you know, and I think Paul's been quite involved in the water project. You know, there's a perfect example that's played out over the last 6 months. Regina's going after the Canadian Water Agency. Saskatoon has supported it. We've supported a couple of the Saskatoon initiatives. You know, that's pretty cool and unheard of from what I recall, Paul, in the last number of years. But here we are, 2 urban cities working together to achieve some really cool things. And a lot of the local organizations, including Sarita, supported us on the water project. We've supported them on a couple of their other projects as well. So let's build off that. It's, to me, that's absolutely essential if we're going to truly grow this province and be great. So yeah, it's fundamental to everything we do, in my view.
Thanks, John. I'm just wondering, Brian, Joanne, or Paul, do you have anything you want to add?
I'll just quickly add that I agree with everything John's saying, but also this is an opportunity with lots of federal funding going to be out there to support all of the provinces, all of the country. We need to work together to make sure that Saskatchewan gets Saskatchewan gets their share and it goes to the right place. And we don't need to compete with each other to do that. We just need to make sure that we're working as one big team to do that.
And I would just add to public-private partnerships around infrastructure too are needed and I think can be successful. That's the construction sector certainly could think about those kinds of opportunities. And I know that we also have international investors who are looking for those kinds of opportunities as well.
Yeah, I would just add one thing around an area of potential collaboration that I think we're doing not bad at, but we could excel at and set a standard, is the relationship between the business community and First Nations and their economic aspirations. We could collaborate a lot on that. I was inspired by Ray Heneke when he was at Meadow Lake Tribal Council, the CEO, and he said, you know, we used to chase jobs and it felt like we were the squirrel in the cage. We just kept running and we'd build a school on reserve. We'd tell the contractor we need to have labor on that. And they would say, sure. And then they'd finish the school. The contractor would move on to the next job. Our people were all unemployed again. They were laid off. He said, we never got a First Nations contractor coming out the other end. And we realized what we needed to do was start owning businesses and equity, and jobs and profit jobs would fall out of making profit. And so it was a kind of a milestone turning point. And you fast forward 25 years and we're seeing some real significant opportunities there. And there's no topic that's more top of mind right now than the relationship with First Nations and the broader community. And I have the distinct pleasure and opportunity and honor of chairing the board of a First Nations company. And I see this on an ongoing basis. And just, there is a real opportunity for something significant here to help them own a bigger piece of the economic pie. And Joanne, I think about the piece that Alex wrote last week on the blog on, imagine what Saskatchewan and Saskatoon's economy would look like if First Nations were flourishing economically. And there's the fresh money coming in, but also then the removal of the burden on the social system. And so, it's a dual-edged sword. It's a win-win, and it really is an opportunity for us to really take advantage of the situation as it's presented today. I think about what John just did with the Canada Water Agency. Interesting, it was a joint bid between the City of Regina and Treaty 4 and the File Hills Qu'Appelle Tribal Council. That's the first of my recollection that there was a joint bid like that, where they were equal partners going forward asking for something. And it's going to be a pivot piece in this, John, you'd agree, was First Nations University. None of this even would have started if First Nations University wasn't there. So here's an asset. Let's put some better use to it. And there's a real opportunity. And the appetite for this right now is huge. People want to sit down and have this collaborative conversation and what can we make positive come forward. And I had a board meeting of our First Nations company last week, and we have a couple of elders who they're not board members, they're advisors to us. So it was the day that the announcement came out about Cowessess, and it was a pretty tough day for us. So I asked the elder to reflect, and he offered this observation. He said, there is a reason the rear view or the front windshield is 50 times bigger than the rear view mirror. You have to see where you've been, but it's way bigger looking forward. And so there's an opportunity looking forward for us here.
Thanks, Paul. Brian, I have a question specific for you. Prior to your time in government, you did spend time in manufacturing and construction. And giving our audience today, clearly construction is an area that we're focused on. So what role do you see construction playing as we go forward? And perhaps more specifically as well, what role do you see for construction playing in Saskatchewan's ready-to-use industrial land?
I don't think I have a really brilliant response to those questions, but We've talked a little bit already about how the construction industry needs to make sure that they're being competitive with the prices that a company can get in other places. You know, we need to make sure that we're not looking at projects as kind of a cash cow, but instead think more in terms of being part of a project team where we want to bring the absolute best value that we can for the customer, get things done on time, on budget, you know, that sort of thing. And all of that is going to help with attracting investment, and word gets around. I have heard things through the grapevine when companies have run into trouble with getting their project done on time or whatever. You know, word gets around, unfortunately, and it's really important that the construction industry understand that and make sure that we're developing the right kind of reputation, I guess I would say. And then as far as the shovel-ready industrial sites go, of course, construction has the role of preparing the ground and bringing the utilities to the property, all that kind of stuff, just the preparatory work. I think there probably are opportunities as well to consider taking on the role of a developer. You know, these things don't happen with somebody willing to put out the capital and take a chance. That said, I also recognize how risky it can be to lay out a lot of money on speculation, right? So it's challenging, but clearly a role is there in doing the groundwork, potentially a role in becoming a project partner or a developer and investor yourself, you know. So, and those are kind of the things that I saw in those questions.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. John or Joanne or Paul, do you have anything you want to add?
Just on the, I think the infrastructure approach is absolutely critical. And I think, you know, Paul alluded to this, there's some $2 billion plus of announced projects. And hopefully obviously the Saskatchewan Construction Committee will be major players in that. But there's also some work being done, as I understand it, nationally between the provinces in terms of, you know, a more coordinated infrastructure strategy for Canada. And, you know, there's got to be different ways of looking at how governments prioritize investments. I'm a big believer that there's got to be a little different model around infrastructure investment that I'll call it community empowered infrastructure investments, where we make the best decisions to obviously make our cities stronger from an infrastructure perspective, but also from an investment attraction perspective. We've got some major gaps, water, wastewater, some of those things in order to attract some of these ag and value companies. I think Joanne referenced that there's some of the same challenges. And then part of that too is figuring out finance models that make sense at different levels, and also being proactive to invest in infrastructure up front that eventually will attract companies, head offices, hopefully, into Regina, because we've actually got the infrastructure in place. So infrastructure is a huge one that we've really got to get our heads around.
Thanks, John. So Paul, I have a bit of a specific question for you as well. Clearly, you've been involved in the business scene and the political scene for most of your career for many years. So I'm just interested in how have the opportunities changed over the years, and what do you see our learnings, or perhaps some of the challenges we've had, how we've learned from those and how we can benefit from that going forward. So a bit of a look back, and perhaps more importantly, using the bigger front windshield, a bit of a look forward.
Yeah, you know, a couple of things. One, I would, sorry about that. I have, somebody must have come to the house, so the dog is barking, but forgive us on that. A couple of things. One, I would say our attitude has improved a lot in Saskatchewan. 20 years ago, I had a chance to work on behalf of the Sask Chamber on the Action Saskatchewan initiative, and probably the greatest observation we took from that was what we call the scarcity-based mindset, which said, if you're doing well, it must mean you're getting a bigger piece of the pie. So if it stands to reason, if you're getting a bigger piece, I got to get a smaller piece. And as a consequence, I have to hate your success. And so we had an anti-success bias. I think we maybe turned that around a little bit. And so that would be one observation. Number two, and this would be the big one in my view, was 25 years ago, I had a chance, or 35 years ago, oh boy, you're talking about, you asked me to reflect on a career. So here we are. I traveled to China with Mike Harcourt when he was still mayor of Vancouver, before he became premier of BC. And we had a chance to meet with the mayor of Guangzhou, which at the time was Vancouver's sister city. And you know, the place was so congested. We had the meeting, was a Saturday night at 6:30. And I asked, why are you meeting on Saturday night? And Harcourt said, they tell me that's when we can get there. So we go to this meeting, and Harcourt asked his counterpart, what's your biggest issue? And he said, well, I have the city cordoned off by the military right now. And they said, why would you do that? And he said, well, you heard what's happened. Factories have been pushed up the river, Pearl River, from Hong Kong because they ran out of people in Hong Kong. They had more jobs than people. So 2 million jobs got dropped into Guangzhou. So people left the farm and were moving into the city, and they're coming at a rate of 6,000 a day. And he said, I can't house them. So I've cordoned off the city till I can get some housing built. And the thought that went through my mind was, there isn't a mayor in Canada who wouldn't kill for 6,000 jobs. This guy's getting them every day. It's a plague for him. And what was really going on was the shift. The 500 million people who moved from the farm to the city in China and became the middle class, that demanded a better diet, mostly protein. And that impacted Saskatchewan, because farmers here were told, start producing more protein. And we changed the way we did agriculture. So a decision made, or an activity that happened halfway around the world, affected us. So I think partly is, we need to be more globally cognizant, and we have to understand our history a little better. So those would be the two big seminal points. And the last one is, when we had the boom in 2007, 8, 9, that was a balance sheet boom. It was about investment flowing into the province. We had $40 billion basically pumped into potash mines and oil fields, and that led to the development of the North Saskatoon, the development of North Regina, and all that sector to service the industry. This one is an income statement one. It's about the price of commodities and cash flow. So it's, what's the price of oil? How much volume? What's the price of wheat? How much volume? And they're slightly different. And it will take more skill this time around to actually be able to translate that into people, to moving population here. When you're building stuff, people come. Now it's just cash. So we have to figure out, what are we going to invest that cash in? And just remember that bumper sticker. Dear Lord, please bring back the boom, and I promise not to piss it away this time, right? So we've got to, as a province, have a conversation about, how are we going to use this capital that's about to flow in here, and to use it wisely. And I would take you back to my point about setting a vision and a goal. And I think it wouldn't be unreasonable for us to start talking about 5 million people in Saskatchewan. Comes with a lot of bells and whistles. I mean, mostly there's industry starts to, communities become self-sufficient, you end up with more political clout, just a whole lot of things happen if you've got population.
Great, thanks, Paul. So maybe just to ask the participants if there's any questions, if you want to put those in the chat. I'm not seeing any yet. If we don't have any, we'll sort of move into some final comments by all the panelists, or we'll at least start those and perhaps interrupt them if there are any questions. I think we've just had some absolutely great conversation, lots of positive comments, which I think is always wonderful. The one conversation we didn't really go down the path of that might be good for a future conversation will be to talk a little bit about the lack of skilled workers as we go forward. I think that is an issue that does deserve more time and more conversation. So it might be something that a group is interested in as we go forward over the next few months, because that clearly will be something we will need to address. And I think when you tie that with Paul's Saskatchewan Boom 2.0, I think it just it becomes even more significant. So perhaps what I'll do is I will give each of the panelists 2 minutes to make some final comments, and really sort of just if you want a bit of perspective overall, what are your sort of highlights is what you see us needing to do to ensure that Saskatchewan's ready for investors, is the best place for those investors so they choose to come here, and then finally that we keep them in Saskatchewan. So I'll turn it over to you, and perhaps I'll just go the way I see you on my screen right now. So I'll start with Joanne.
Thanks. I think I'm going to make more of just a general comment. This is around reflecting on what comes next and making sure we're not limiting our mindset to what we have and what's happened in the past, and we open up to what could be in the future. So I'm thinking about things like Saskatchewan having 22 of 31 critical minerals in our province. And, you know, years ago, I never heard anyone even talk about rare earth elements or, you know, helium plants or things like that, now that's just the way we talk. We've got these things, we're going to process them here and we're going to move forward with it. So I guess not to, you know, to continue to support the industry we've always had, the agriculture, the, you know, fertilizer, fuel, but also look forward with an open mind as to what can come next and how do we continue to develop that for the future.
Good, thanks, Joanne. John, your comments?
Sure, just brief. We have incredible momentum. We need to amplify and tell that story together outside Saskatchewan and actually locally. We need to work better together in investment traction, both locally and nationally. I can't agree more with Paul in terms of vision, but I would suggest that it's provincial vision, but how do we interconnect that locally, regionally, and provincially so that we're all singing from the same song sheet? And just a final comment or a reminder is Saskatoon, Regina, and I suspect some of the other urban cities, we have the youngest populations in the country. That is an incredible opportunity, one, to keep them here, empower them to be part of creating the vision and really setting them up for success. And that's pretty cool to think that we actually are in that position. And let's not allow them to go somewhere else. Let's keep them here and also attract youth into Saskatchewan. I think that's all interconnected with all the things we've talked about today.
Great, thanks, John. I'm wondering if that young population includes those of us on this call. That was my first thought. You don't need to respond to that. I can answer. Brian?
My thoughts are really just a summation of the things that we've already talked about, but I think that investors need to have transparent infrastructure costs and construction costs so they know exactly what they're going to face here and don't have any unpleasant surprises. We have to find a way to make our utility costs more competitive. And that's especially true on power, I think, but sometimes our water rates are also high, and there are options. You know, we need to think about ways that we can be more competitive. And the importance of training, you mentioned already skilled workers. That would be a good topic for a future conversation. And I agree, we have to make sure that training keeps up to industry needs and that our training institutions are delivering training in a way that works with the needs of the economy. There's probably also more that we could do to make it easier for skilled workers to immigrate here, or more appealing to immigrate here. Tax competitiveness is important, and then the final thought from me would just be the need to develop the industries around the ones that we're trying to attract rather, to strengthen the entire supply chain for these industries, upstream and then downstream as well, for co-products and byproducts. Those are the kind of things we need to work on, I think.
Great, thanks, Brian. And last 2 minutes, Paul, I guess go to you.
All right, I want to comment on John's recognition of the age of the demographics of the population, and I think there's something there. And first of all, I think if you're going to capitalize on that young population, rule number one is make some room for them at the leadership table. So we've got to get them involved in decision making. I think back to my days at RITA, we had a future leaders group. We had a parallel economic development board that was made up of high school and university students and a couple of young workers. And I have to tell you that the insights they gave us were profound. They really did change the way the so-called senior board thought. But here's one other observation. There were 20 young people on that board. Every one of those 20 is still in Saskatchewan, mostly in Regina, all of them leading companies or owning companies, or leading in their particular field of endeavor, including some national stuff headquartered here. So that's a real powerful lesson for me. And I had an opportunity to interview a guy named Nenad Bach, who you probably never heard of, but the New Yorker, now back in his home country of Croatia, liable to be the primary export of Croatia, but he's a globally recognized musician, and performed with everybody from Pavarotti to Grateful Dead. So I mean, this guy is clearly covers some waterfront. He made this comment to me on economic development. He said, a community that has good coffee, good food, good art, and good music, companies don't leave. And he pointed to Austin, Texas, and he said, the mayor of Austin said to Janis Joplin and Stevie Ray Vaughan and to Willie Nelson, we got some space here, bring some musicians, just bring all the young musicians you can find to town. And I will clear the way to let them busk on street corners, and we will build them an opportunity to perform and to build their art. Fast forward 30 years, and what is Austin, Texas today, the fastest growing city in the US. And it's a place nobody wants to leave, everybody wants to go to. Well, we've got a soundstage that's not being used right now. We've got a recording studio in Regina that's available for free. I mean, we could be talking about that kind of stuff, but it comes back to that notion of us as a province and maybe as individual communities deciding what is it we want to be. And, I think for me, it's about adding to the population. As I watched Ottawa and Regina fight over politics, one of the asks I would have from Regina side would be, I need 1 million passports. I need 1 million citizens in Saskatchewan, and trade that off with Ottawa. What do you need from us? You got plenty of, talk about us and beating us up a lot on climate change. Well, here's what I need in exchange, because we consume about probably 2 or 3% of the energy we produce in this province. We export the rest. And for those who say all you got to do is switch to windmills and green power, they forget that, yeah, we could power Saskatchewan, but we would lose the 98% of the export value, and we wouldn't be replacing that. So that's where the business side of it needs to come into the conversation. And lastly, I'd say, let's tell the world about what we want to do, what we want to be. And I love the notion of these new international offices we put in place. And we got more coming, I hope, maybe in Central and South America. And I've always supported these things. We used to have some that were kind of like political drop-off spots for former cabinet ministers, and they weren't particularly effective. But we did have one in New York that worked really well, and it was a model that I hope it looks like we're going to be taking forward. And Saskatchewan's an exporting province, and if we don't make sales calls and have salespeople around the world, then I think we're missing the opportunity. So well done on that one. I think that's a great step forward, and that is about a part of telling the story. So anyway, that's
great.
it.
Thanks so much. So I guess it's a huge thank you to all four of you, to Joanne, to John, to Paul, and to Brian for sharing your time and for sharing your insights and your knowledge. I think it's been a great session. And I think now I'll turn it back to Mark. I think he's got a few closing comments.
Sure. Thank you, Shelley. And again, thanks to our panelists for your time today. I think this is easily a discussion that could continue for hours, and probably something we should do again, preferably over beers in front of a live audience in the not too distant future, because I think that is something we're all looking forward to. Shelley, thank you for making time to moderate this today and for helping move us through the discussion. And thanks again to Val and for Stephen for the earlier presentation. To all of our attendees, thanks for your time today. A reminder that the session has been recorded and will be made available to our membership. And as always, thank you to SupplierLink and to all of our sponsors who help make the work we do on behalf of the construction industry possible. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day. Have a fantastic Canada Day tomorrow, and I look forward to seeing all of you together in person in the near future. See you all.